Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of various aspects of Japanese music and culture, and today I'm going to be talking about 3 quirky, new or newish Japanese TV shows. These are all currently available on Netflix in the US. I should say that I'm going to do these in ascending order of how much I liked them. The first one is called, in English, Their Marriage. The original title was Shiawase na Kekkon. It stars Sadao Abe and Takako Matsu. It's about a famously single lawyer turned TV presenter, a guy, who meets and falls in love, somewhat inexplicably, with a woman who, it turns out, has a kind of mysterious past. And she lives with her family in this slightly odd, sort of mutually dependent relationship. They all have a floor in a condo building. And we learn in the course of the story that 15 years ago, she was accused of murdering her then fiancé, who was a painter. And there's a policeman, a young policeman, who is trying to get the case reopened, thinks that she's guilty. The point of view character is the guy, the lawyer TV presenter, who's trying to figure out the truth of what happened 15 years ago. His wife's memory is apparently patchy on the subject, always a slightly sketchy writerly trick. And in the course of the show, we're going to sort of reconstruct what actually happened, what the truth of this event was, whether she's responsible, whether other people in her orbit were responsible, and what's going on. So it's kind of a murder mystery with suspense elements. But one of the oddities of the show is that it's tonally really inconsistent. There are some scenes that are played very light and for laughs, and others that are very sort of dark and tension-ridden and such. And the two often don't clearly sit all that well together, in my opinion. But it is kind of fascinating because it's something that a Western show just wouldn't do, I don't think. Like a British or US show tend to be tonally fairly consistent, and the acting style is very consistent. In this, we've got people doing kind of serious, gritty realism, very small, and then other people doing sort of big, broad comedy, and they suddenly show up in these scenes, and you're like, how do these things coexist in the same narrative universe? And that was one of my issues with the show. This was one that, to be honest, we sort of had to push ourselves through, my wife and I, because we wanted to know how it ended, but there were moments where we were like, what is going on here? And I was sort of losing interest. One of the things that I find fascinating about it as a Japanese show, however, is that Japan does romance very differently from the West. And one of the things that you see here is that sort of that red thread of destiny idea, where two people are just sort of meant to be together for reasons that are kind of inexplicable, you know? The red thread of destiny, which the invisible thread that can bind people together, has been used to justify arranged marriage and the opposite, right? To say, we don't want arranged marriage because I'm connected to this other person. But one of the things that it does is that it kind of defies rational explanation. And that's one of the things that I found hard to get here. It's perfectly capably acted. I don't have a problem with the lead actors at all. Neither are like stunningly attractive or anything like that, which I also like. I like the ordinariness of it. But when they meet and there's this instant connection, especially with this guy who has no interest in long-term relationships, likes being by himself, and suddenly he's compelled by this woman about whom he knows nothing. And it's not like she's this sort of amazing bombshell kind of... It's like, I don't understand the connection here. And there were multiple times in the course of the show where I was like, I don't understand what's keeping them together. If they feel sort of such hostility and suspicion around each other. I don't know why the relationship is continuing. Now, there are moments of sweetness and genuineness, and it is in some ways quite uplifting in certain respects. But there are oddities about the way the story is told. The other thing that I think is really uniquely, not uniquely Japanese, but there's a particular Japanese flavor to it, is that the show, and this is true of some of the other stuff I'm going to talk about as well, is saturated with the sense of public opinion and how people navigate their lives and their professional obligations when there's a firestorm of tabloid interest and social media discussion of them, much of which is surprisingly vitriolic, right? And this is one of the features that we've seen a lot in Japanese TV, particularly over the last few years, maybe particularly post-pandemic, where there's this sense that one of the problems in Japan is that people have to spend so much time being nice to everybody in person and polite that they can be particularly unpleasant online when they have the kind of invisibility that social media gives you. And that's something that comes up throughout this show, this sense of people trying to sort of live their lives while feeling the pressure of other people passing judgment on them. Is it worth watching? If you are interested in sort of slightly quirky suspense, yes, it's worth a go. I wouldn't be surprised if there are times when you start to feel like it needs a bit of an engine to move it forward. And there's sort of revelation and there's discovery about the story as it progresses, but I didn't find it as compelling as I hoped I would. And some of that tonal inconsistency is part of the problem. I liked it best when it was lightest, if I was honest. The next show I want to talk about is I can't even say it, Talentless Takano, which is one of the odder shows that I've seen of late. Is very hard to get your head around a lot of the time, but I actually really liked it. It stars Akihisa Shiono as a sort of wannabe salaryman, young guy who is capable and intelligent, but is socially very awkward, easily intimidated by any kind of human interaction and having to sort of make presentations or interview, any of that kind of stuff. And Nanao, who is a model and actress who plays Takano of the title. And she is this sort of drop-dead gorgeous young Japanese woman, very tall, statuesque, elegant, and who gives off this air of absolute confidence and certainty and capability, all of which is utterly unearned. She has absolutely no idea what is going on at any given time. So the two of them are hired by this small company at the same time, and it quickly becomes apparent that while he's this sort of bumbling, sad sack sort of guy for whom nothing really goes right, but is at least, pretty good at his job, apart from the human part, the human interaction part, she's the opposite. She looks like the swan gliding across the water, and everybody immediately assumes that she's the superior, that she's in charge, that she knows what she's doing, and she is absolutely clueless. And it's fascinating because in the first few episodes, you're constantly like, what is happening? What's this woman's deal? She doesn't seem to know anything about anything. She doesn't know what the company does. She doesn't know how to do the job. She doesn't know how to work the computer that she's assigned to. And if you don't stand over her, she will just stare at it all day watching cat videos or watching nothing at all. If there's a nice blue screen, she's quite content to just look at that. And when she's called out on her incompetence, It's like water off a duck's back. People screaming at her and yelling at her, and she just doesn't seem to care. Nothing ruffles her feathers at all. What's really interesting, though, is that in the course of the show, and it's a great little study, an office workplace kind of show with lots of quirky characters and different things going on in different areas, and the minor characters all have their own little dynamics and their own idiosyncrasies. But in the course of the show, it becomes increasingly clear that despite her uselessness, she somehow makes the rest of the team work better. And more importantly, they seem to sort of learn something about themselves and become better people in the process. None of it makes a lot of sense. And it's not deliberate on Takano's part because she's oblivious to all of it. She has this sort of shine about her, this aura, but she's kind of dead weight as far as the business is concerned. And it's a quirky, strange show where you're constantly saying, what is happening? Who or what is this person? There was a point early on when I was like, is she even human? Is she a robot? Is she some sort of android or something? An idea which I think gets played with later on in the show. They know, right? The people making the show know that you're going to be thinking about this. And they sort of float a couple of different explanations for her strangeness. But she gives you the impression of somebody who looks human but doesn't really know anything about humanity or the world in which humans live. And that of itself is I find fascinating. I don't want to say how the show ends. The ending is somewhat open-ended, but there is a moment in the final episode when something happens. You'll know if you've seen it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a moment, something happens, and it makes you kind of rethink the entire series to date. And it offers a sort of explanation for what's going on. Not a real explanation, and it sort of then gets kind of undercut by the way the show actually finishes up. But there is a moment where you're like, oh, okay, so I was right to have some of these questions in mind. But it's sweet and touching, and there's a great theme song that runs throughout the show in that sort of traditional Japanese TV format, where it kicks in the last few minutes of the show. And like a lot of the shows, these Japanese shows that I like, again, it foregrounds the specifically Japanese dynamic of the workplace and the pressures of being in a workplace, pressures both on getting a job and then the pressures on not getting fired, and the sort of oddity of people not getting fired for incompetence, because it's clear that she should have been fired like almost the moment she walked in the door. But the company feels obligated to keep her around and try to find a way to use her, But the other thing is, of course, that it uses the ensemble, it develops the relationships between the people, and she, though she is herself a cipher, like unknowable, right? That she becomes a kind of prism through which the light of the show gets diffused into everybody else, if that makes any kind of sense. That when people deal with her, they find them, it's like dealing with a mirror almost. They find themselves sort of discovering things about themselves and their colleagues and so on. And the core idea ultimately is upbeat and positive and supportive in the way that few Western shows are. This sense that these people are all kind of in the same boat and trying to uplift each other, even though they're very different and they do it in different ways. So, I really liked it. I liked the strangeness of it, and that very Japanese sense at the end that there is more to the world than we know, and the strangeness, whatever that strangeness is something that exists very close to our own lives, right? This is something I've been talking about with my translator, Niwa, who did the Hideki Smith translation, and we've been talking about the difference between the US or UK and Japan in terms of the way we think about supernatural creatures and the world of yokai. And there's something of that here at the end where you start to think there's a curious acceptance of whether you call it paranormal or the otherworldly or the supernatural, whatever it is, something. We don't know what it is, but people surprisingly just kind of roll with it as if their sense of the universe is a little different from the one that we assume in the West, in which for most people this kind of strangeness is reserved for, say, religious experience or other kinds of things. And most people don't really treat it as a real presence in their lives. So I really like this. It's very quirky and odd. It might not work for you, but I would recommend that you give it a try. So the next one that I want to talk about, which in some ways is my favorite of the three, somewhat surprisingly, is Romantics Anonymous. And it's the only one that gets a complete Netflix trailer.
このチョコレートが皆さんの幸せになりますように。
幸せのチョコレート。
たまにはお礼を匿名の天才ショコラティエさんに。
顔見ようとしたら二度と取引できなくなるわよ。バヒッチ。
本日より社長に就任しました藤原宗介と申します。匿名のショコラティエに関しては契約解除をお願いするつもりです。
サカチバカチ。
何か。
実は私がその。
ちょっと。
ラップの。
悪いけど雨に濡れて帰ってもらえますか。は？ごめんなさい。濡れたくない。ダメだ。無理だ。事情があるんで助けてあげてください。
誰にでも秘密はありますから。
So, as you probably gathered there, this is a romantic comedy of a sort. It stars Shun Oguri as basically the director of a chocolate company, and Han Hyo-ju as Hannah Lee, who is a Korean Japanese chocolatier. And the title tells you this is a romance, and it's not the kind of thing I would normally watch. My wife had just started to watch it, and she's like, you might like this, let's try it. So I went to it. I was more interested in the chocolate, frankly, than I was in the romance. And like a number of food-centered TV shows from Japan, and I'm thinking of things like Midnight Diner and Grand Maison Tokyo and their various sort of spin-offs, the preparation, the sort of loving preparation of exquisite food is absolutely at the heart of this show, and it was partly initially what drew me to it. As a show, and I think that this is maybe why Netflix is pushing it a little bit more in the West than the others, it's a bit more conventional in terms of its structure, that it is a romance. But it's made unique and a little odd by a number of factors. One is the sort of the Japanese-Korean fusion, which immediately gives it a slightly different tonality and a slightly different sensibility, and raises different kinds of issues about who fits in, right? Because the chocolatier, the premise of the show is that a company has been sort of bought over by this large company, and the chocolate company relies on this anonymous chocolatier, this woman who shows up in the first thing in the morning with a batch of chocolates that she then leaves and takes off, and nobody knows who she is. They don't see her, they don't deal with her. And the reason for this is that the woman herself has a kind of social anxiety disorder, you might call it, a phobia, that she can't stand being looked at and particularly making eye contact with people. So she's content to sort of work at home, go out just to deliver the chocolates and then retreat. The guy who takes over as the manager, as the representative of the incoming company, also has some anxiety, which is much more physical. He can't be he's very uncomfortable with his own body and with the idea of touching other people, which is traced back to his relationship to his older brother, who was hospitalized with an illness, probably some sort of immune deficiency disease or something along those lines, in which he was sort of in an oxygen tent and nobody could interact with him. And there's a moment in which his younger brother gives him candy and the brother dies. And the younger boy then carries this sense of his own toxicity into the rest of his life. So, as you can hear, despite the lightness and the goofiness of the show, it's underlaid with this really quite weighty sense of melancholy and people wrestling with real stuff.
もしかして人の視線が怖いんですか？じゃあどうして私の目は見れるんですか？私も人に触れることができない。でも花さんだけは大丈夫なんです。
なんで私たちをお互いに大丈夫なんですかね。
運命の人だから。
絶対ありません。
ですよね。
無駄な行動をやめてレシピの確保を優先すべきだ。
ルソベールを潰すおつもりなんです。ルソベールを守るためには
匿名のショコラティエが必要なんですか？
前もせんなよ。誰かのために変わりたいという気持ち。
誰のために変わりたくなったの？
匿名の恋人たち。
As with the previous shows that I mentioned, again, what I like is the Japaneseness of the environment in which everybody's having to work together, but the two central characters are people who are temperamentally incapable of working with other people. And the show, of course, is about the way that they connect with each other, their sort of trials and tribulations of trying to get this confectionery company to stay afloat, their participation in a tournament, and various other things, that require the team. And again, there's a sort of significant ensemble cast here, the team working together to figure out how to function as a unit and make the best possible chocolate that they can. And it's kind of beautiful and wonderful and and silly, but also, has moments of real poignancy and emotional power. I must say, I was really caught off guard by how well it worked and by how much I was sort of drawn to it. It is, as a lot of these shows, wonderfully acted. It's beautifully restrained and human and ordinary and doesn't rely on the big splashy plot device and the sort of special effects or the equivalent thereof, of the big sudden or dramatic expose or whatever. It doesn't do those kind of things. It's small and quiet and human-centered, character-driven, however you want to put it. And I think it works really, really well. I would strongly recommend it, especially if you do, romance stuff at all. But even if you don't, I think that the romance stuff here is earned in ways that sometimes it isn't. And we can sort of see these two misfits sort of circling each other in interesting ways, both sort of interested in different things, prioritizing different things, and trying to figure out how they connect to the rest of the world and seeing their struggles mirrored in somebody else. That, I think, is the root power of the relationship, which I think is really quite compelling. And however quirky and strange they may seem to be, their particular foibles and oddities are merely minor exaggerations of things that everybody kind of deals with, and that we see it throughout the show from other people as well. So, Romantics Anonymous. I really liked it. What's the Japanese title? I guess the Japanese title would come out as something like Tokume no Koibito Tachi. Tokume no Koibito Tachi. So, anonymous lovers. So the same kind of title. So I would recommend it. Check it out. See what you think. If you have seen any of these shows, feel free to comment. Tell me what you liked best. And if you have recommendations for other shows, please make those recommendations here so that I can check them out. And if I like them or find them interesting, then I can respond to them as well. That's all I'm going to say. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe. Check out my books. Of course, my Japanese books are the ones that I'm foregrounding on this channel. I have another channel for other books and writing stuff. Check out my Patreon page. My patrons get to see these videos in advance, and their support helps me to keep this unmonetized channel going. I have a little Dashery store where you can find mugs and t-shirts and things. And that's all. I will talk to you soon. Thanks very much. Bye.